this and become a reality and get this bill passed, particularly, hopefully, this week. I yield the floor.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, before I yield time to the Senator from California, I would ask unanimous consent that Alec Johnson, a legislative fellow detailed to the Committee on Appropriations, be granted floor privileges for the duration of consideration of the bill. I ask unanimous consent that Commander Lacey, a U.S. naval officer who is currently serving as Senator Shaheen's defense legislative fellow, be granted floor privileges during the duration of S. 1197. And from Senator Cardin, I ask unanimous consent that floor privileges be granted to Major Nathan Summers, U.S. Air Force officer who is currently serving as a defense legislative fellow in Senator Cardin's office for the duration of Senate consideration of S. 1197. I think I left out the first name, by the way. It's Commander Tassia Lacey, who is Senator Shaheen's defense legislative fellow. So I ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
I yield 15 minutes to the senior senator from California.
Thank you very much,
Senator from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise to support the Levin McCain amendment and have added my name as a co-sponsor. I'd also like to speak in support of provisions authored by Chairman Levin that are in this year's Defense Authorization Act, which provide more flexibility that the President and Secretary of Defense need in order to move detainees from Guantanamo. I strongly support the Levin-McCain-Feinstein amendment. Here's what it would do. It would clarify that Guantanamo detainees transferred to the United States for law of war detention do not have any additional rights or benefits, such as the right to claim asylum. So it limits it. It would clarify that Gitmo detainees transferred to the United States may not be released from law of war detention into the United States. And thirdly, it would require a detailed plan to be submitted to Congress on how to close Guantanamo, including the specific facilities intended to be used to hold detainees inside the United States. I've heard Senator McCain talk about this, request it, and I believe it is a very valid need. It has been 12 years since the attacks of 9/11 and the United States invasion of Afghanistan. In the ensuing years, 779 people were brought to Guantanamo without charge, and for many of them, simply for being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Most of the 164 left have been held for more than 10 years. Those transferred to Guantanamo from CIA custody in black sites have been there now for more than 7 years. And unfortunately, we still have not figured out a way to close Guantanamo. President George W. Bush called for it to be closed. So did former Secretaries of State Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell, as well as former Secretaries of Defense Bob Gates and Leon Panetta, among others. In fact, here's what President Bush wrote on pages 179 and 180 of his memoir, Decision Points. There are things I wish had come out differently. I'm frustrated that the military tribunals moved so slowly. Even after the Military Commissions Act was passed, another lawsuit delayed the process again. By the time I left office, we held only 2 trials. The difficulty of conducting trials made it harder to meet a goal I had set in my second term, closing the prison at Guantanamo in a responsible way. While I believe opening Guantanamo after 9/11 was necessary, the detention facility had become a propaganda tool for our enemies and a distraction for our allies. While I would like to go much further, and this is not the quote of the President, this is my language, while I would like to go much further and close the facility immediately, The provisions in this bill will ease the transfer restrictions so that detainees can be held in other countries or tried, convicted, and put in a proper maximum security facility in the United States. There are three categories of detainees left at Guantanamo. First, 46 will continue to be held on preventive detention, meaning they are being held under international law until the end of hostilities, whenever that may be. It could be years, it could be decades. Second, 34 detainees have been slated for prosecution, and of those, 3 detainees have already been convicted in a military commission and are still serving their time at Guantanamo. But most of these 34 have not even been charged, and there is no indication when they will be. The final category is the largest. 84 of the 164 detainees currently at Guantanamo were cleared for transfer by a 2010, that's 3 years ago, a 2010 interagency process carried out by our national security and intelligence agencies. But current law needlessly complicates efforts to transfer those 84 men. President Bush transferred over 530 detainees from Guantanamo during his time in office, and unfortunately, many went on to commit terrorist acts because there were no individual assessments done on each detainee. But these individual assessments have been carried out by the Obama administration. Despite his commitment to close Guantanamo, President Obama has been able to only transfer 67 detainees during his first term, and only 2 recommended for transfer has been successfully sent home under the burdensome procedures now in place. More are on the way. But this is an unacceptable delay because the government cleared these detainees for transfers years ago. Sections 1031, 1032, and 1033 of this bill will give the President more flexibility to transfer these detainees out of Guantanamo. It's long overdue, and I thank the chairman who's sitting in front of me and the ranking member for these provisions. But even under these provisions, the Secretary of Defense would still have to certify that the transfer is in our nation's security interests and that appropriate steps have been taken to address the risk of recidivism. Congress would have to continue to be notified of such transfers. In March of this year, Lieutenant General John F. Kelly, the head of U.S. Southern Command, which has military responsibility for Guantanamo, testified to Congress about the massive hunger strikes that were going on at the time and said the detainees were devastated at the lack of transfers and the government's failure to execute plans to close it, as the President has promised. In June of this year, I traveled to Guantanamo with Senator McCain and the President's Chief of Staff to see this devastation for myself. On our trip, we saw the process that's used to retain the detainees as they are forced from their cells and brought in to be force-fed. We did not see a detainee being force-fed, but we saw the tube that is forced up their nose and down their throat into their stomach. It is coated with olive oil and lanacane if necessary, and it is done daily. We saw the restraints at the legs, the arms, and the head where detainees are held, not too different from the image of a death row convict in an electric chair. I said at the time, and I will say again today, the military and civilian personnel at work on Guantanamo are carrying out their duties with dedication, skill, and honor. My opposition to continued detention at Guantanamo is not an indictment against them. It is with a failed and bankrupt policy, including here in Congress, and now is the time to change it. Another thing that struck me is the enormous costs we are sinking into this isolated facility each year. Detention operations at Guantanamo now total approximately $5 billion since the facility opened in January of '02. According to the most recent estimates provided by the Department of Defense, the total cost for FY13 is estimated to be $454.1 million, which equals approximately $2.8 million per detainee. That works out to be more than 35 times the cost to hold a prisoner in the Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado. This Supermax facility currently houses a number of al-Qaeda terrorists, including Zacarias Moussaoui, shoe bomber Richard Reed, and the would-be Christmas Day bomber Umar Farouk Abdulmuttalib. In this era of sequestration and furloughs, how can we justify spending approximately $2.8 million per Guantanamo detainee? Now, even with near-unanimous support across the current and past administration to close the structure down, some appear to question whether there still is a national security need to shutter the facility. I believe it is clear that Guantanamo is still a symbol that motivates our enemies and draws more and more young Muslims to fight against the United States. And this is just not my determination, but also the findings of our intelligence community. Last week, Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, wrote to the Senate Intelligence Committees noting his support for the closure of Guantanamo, in which he offered the following examples of how al-Qaeda and its affiliates continue to reference Guantanamo in furtherance of their global jihadist goals. Al-Qaeda leader Ayman Zawahiri, in an audio statement in July of this year, cited the detention without trial of Gitmo prisoners as one indication of American hypocrisy and indiscriminate persecution of innocent Muslims. And an article about the Boston Marathon bombings in the most recent edition of Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's Inspire magazine. This is kind of a diabolical magazine that Al-Qaeda puts out. This is the one published in June. It highlighted the ongoing detention of prisoners at Gitmo as one of the purported justifications of terrorist attacks like 9/11 and the Boston Marathon bombings. Here's what the article said, and I quote, "If we note down all that has been and is still being carried out by America against Muslim nations, we will run out of pages. There are also secret prisons and black sites filed. We could not miss out Guantanamo Bay detention camp. The American nation should have a good grasp of all of these and other historic facts so that they can comprehend the background and the context of the Boston Marathon operation, Detroit, September 11, and other operations which are barely a wave of anger and vengeance," end quote. Furthermore, Guantanamo is referenced 20 times in the previous 10 issues of Inspire magazine. Mr. President, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the letter from the DNI dated November 12, 2013.
Without objection.
I would also like to say that I just visited the 9/11 memorial this past Saturday and was extraordinarily moved by that memorial. It's just an amazing place, and it really brings to your heart the gravity of what that situation was. You then went down in the museum and I saw the steel, just exactly where the plane went through the steel superstructure. And the staircase where hundreds of our people fled with smoke following down those stairs. We must prevent another 9/11. And I would like to note that there is a letter from certain members of the September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows that has been sent to us in favor of this bill and the detainee transfer provisions in the bill. And I'd like to put the letter from Peaceful Tomorrows into the record, if I may.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. By the end of President Obama's term in office, some detainees will have been held at Guantanamo without charge or trial for 15 years. 15 years. We need to change this outcome, and we can do so with no threat to our nation's security. For one detainee, Ibrahim Idris, his physical and mental problems at Guantanamo have gone on for so long that the government decided to finally drop its opposition to his legal argument that he is far too sick to stay locked up. There are others at Guantanamo who are desperate and in need of medical treatment.
The Senator's time has expired.
All right, may I just finish this paragraph, and I'll put the rest in the record?
Without objection, Senator has 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. That is why Section 1032 of this defense bill will allow the Department of Defense to temporarily transfer Guantanamo detainees to the United States for emergency or critical medical treatment. No one is talking about releasing these detainees into the United States. The section is about providing medical care to people in our custody. I thank the chair, and I'd ask that the remainder of my remarks be included in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I rise today as my colleague from California just rose to show my support for a tough, adaptable, and smart national security policy.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that I yield to Senator Udall 5 minutes.
Without objection.
I thank the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. As I said, I rise in support as the senator from California for a tough, adaptable, and smart national security policy. And what do I mean by that? Well, in this case, I mean that we ought to support provisions that provide the Department of Defense and the President with the flexibility necessary to transfer certain detainees from the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay to face justice in other venues. And in that context, I'm proud to join Chairman Levin and Senator McCain and Senator Feinstein in sponsoring this important bipartisan amendment. For a number of reasons, I strongly believe that its passage would strengthen our national security and is in the best interests of our country. And, Mr. President, I'm joined in that assessment by the Director of National Intelligence, the Secretary of Defense, and many other senior national security leaders, including at least 32 retired, I should say rather 38 retired generals and admirals who've helped to prosecute the war against Islamic extremists. Now, Mr. President, this amendment does not close Guantanamo. It doesn't require the release of detainees into the United States or force the transfer of suspected terrorists to foreign countries. This amendment simply provides the administration with the flexibility to bring justice to Gitmo detainees in the most effective, efficient means possible. The fact is that civilian courts have convicted over 400 suspected terrorists since 2001. The conviction rate for terror suspects in Article 3 courts, that is civilian courts, is nearly 90%. And Mr. President, during the same period, a grand total of 7 detainees at Guantanamo have been convicted by military commissions. And of those 7, 2 convictions were overturned. Now, there are circumstances in which military commissions are appropriate. And I would agree with some of my colleagues that there are detainees held at Guantanamo that should face trial in a military commission. But the fact is that in many cases, the civilian court system is faster, it's more efficient, and more effective at bringing terrorists to justice than military commissions. So why would we handcuff ourselves and limit our options to bring accused terrorists to justice? Mr. President, our enemy already knows that we're tough. We've pursued them all over the globe, we've eliminated their leaders, and we've killed or captured many of their followers. But we can be tough and we can be smart at the same time. And handcuffing our military and justice departments in their efforts to bring our enemies to justice is simply short-sighted and counterproductive. Doing so only impedes justice, erodes the image of the United States, and serves as a recruiting tool for a new generation of terrorists. According to the Defense Department, we're spending about $450 million a year to keep Gitmo open. And the DOD is going to need hundreds of millions more for upgrades and repairs if the facility stays open. That situation is unsustainable, especially in a time of sequestration and rising budget deficits. And without action by Congress, those costs will continue to climb as detainees get older and sicker. And our moral standing will suffer the longer we hold people without trial. Based on evidence, I have faith in our justice system to secure convictions in terrorist cases. We have a system of justice second to none, and prisons that already hold some of the most dangerous criminals in the world. There is no question that these individuals who have been convicted and sentenced, that they will be detained for the rest of their lives with no risk to our citizens. We've proven it time and time again. And as a member of the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees, I receive frequent briefings and reports on our counterterrorism efforts around the world. And I know this amendment will let us continue to prove it again and again in the future. In sum, Mr. President, the Levin, McCain, Feinstein, Udall amendment benefits our national security and should be passed by the Senate without delay. Mr. President, thank you. I note the absence of a quorum, and I yield the floor. I yield the floor, Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
How much time is left on our side?
4 minutes and 15 seconds.
Okay, I would ask unanimous consent that I be able to yield an additional 5 minutes above the 4.5 minutes to Senator Durbin, and that then I understand that if that means that there is less time than allotted to the minority, I would ask unanimous consent that that additional time be used at 5 o'clock and that the vote would then occur a few minutes after 5, if necessary. That's fine.
Without objection? Is there objection?
No, I don't object, but specifically we have a request by the prime author of this bill that will be under consideration at 5 o'clock to have 5 minutes. So I assume that that's the thrust of your UC request, is to give her 5 minutes, even if it happens to fall starting at 5 o'clock.
Is the senator from New Hampshire available at 5 minutes to 5, do we believe?
Yes.
If that's true, I would ask unanimous consent that I be allowed then to modify that previous UC to provide 10 minutes for the senator from Illinois and the last 5 minutes to the senator from New Hampshire.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
First, let me thank my colleague and friend from the state of Oklahoma for yielding time, Senator from Michigan, for manufacturing this close here so that both sides will be heard as we come to this important vote. 11 years now. For 11 years, I've been coming to the Senate floor giving speeches about closing Guantanamo. This is my 66th speech calling for the closure of Guantanamo. This year I hold a hearing in the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights, and I brought in military experts and I asked them, do we need Guantanamo? And here's what they said. In fact, here's what we heard from retired Major General Paul Eaton, who served for 30 years in the General and was the commanding general of the Coalition Military Assistance Training Team in Iraq. He said Guantanamo is a terrorist-creating institution and is a direct facilitator in filling out the ranks of al-Qaeda and other terror organizations that would attack the U.S. or our interest. Guantanamo, General Eaton said, in military terms, is a recruitment tool of the first order. Then I went down to the Southern Command in Miami, Florida. And I met with the generals there who have the responsibility of running Guantanamo. And when I asked them about Guantanamo, there was a sadness that came over the conversation. And they talked about how difficult it was, with about 160 or 165 detainees remaining down there, how difficult and how expensive it was for them to maintain that facility. They accepted it. It was part of their responsibility being in our military. But they basically said to me, when is Congress going to accept its responsibility? The Levin-McCain amendment before us accepts our responsibility. Now let's get down to the bottom line here. Whether you think these terrorists should be in Guantanamo or not in Guantanamo, let's talk about something very basic and very simple. How much does it cost for us to keep in prison one person in Guantanamo for 1 year? $2.7 million. $2.7 million per prisoner per year. How much does it cost the federal taxpayers to take the most dangerous, bloodthirsty, deadly individual that we convict in our criminal courts and put them in the Florence Supermax facility in Colorado where no prisoner has ever escaped? $70,000 a year. What are we trying to prove here? Are we trying to prove in Guantanamo how much money we can spend, let me add waste, on a facility that is totally unnecessary? I asked the director of the U.S. Bureau of Prisons a very basic question. If we sent the most dangerous terrorist at Guantanamo to Florence, Colorado, what is the likelihood that person would escape? He said 0. They don't escape from our Supermax facilities. So we're not keeping America safe by wasting $450 million a year in Guantanamo. And we know that roughly half of those who are being held at Guantanamo should be released. They're not going to be tried for a crime at this point. They should be released. And what the Levin-McCain amendment does is to set up an orderly, thoughtful, sensible way for the transfer of these prisoners. Why do we keep this Guantanamo open? What is the point here? It's as if some lobbyist has us enthralled, that we have to keep Guantanamo open. It isn't about national security anymore. It isn't about the cost of incarceration anymore. It's about something else that I can't even define. So what we need to do is to take those remaining in Guantanamo who can be charged, charge them, try them, incarcerate them. And those who are going to be a danger to the United States should never see the light of day. But why would we continue to waste $2.7 million per year per prisoner to keep Guantanamo open? Throughout its history, Guantanamo has had a checkered past. It's part of Cuba. We send the Cuban government each year a rental check for the Guantanamo facility. They never cash it. They may tear them up. They do maintain the minefield between Guantanamo and the rest of the island of Cuba to make sure that there's no travel between the two, not that anyone would try. That's it. And we maintain this facility because in the earliest days of our fight against terrorism after 9/11, there were legal counsels in the White House like John Yoo who said that Guantanamo Bay is the legal equivalent of outer space. We could put people there, they'll have no rights, and no one will ever know. How wrong he was. Guantanamo has become such a sad symbol that it's time for it to be closed. And it's time for us to do it in a thoughtful, sensible, honorable way, as every great nation should. To maintain Guantanamo for some bragging right that I can't even describe on the floor is simply unacceptable. I'm going to be opposing the amendment that's offered by the senator from New Hampshire and supporting the Levin-McCain bipartisan amendment, which I think deals with this issue in a thoughtful and reasonable way. Do you want to keep America safe? Take those prisoners, those convicted terrorists, put them in a Supermax facility. And if you say to yourself, oh, we don't put known terrorists and convicted terrorists in our federal prison system, how wrong you are. They are all over our federal prison system. In Marion, Illinois, we have convicted terrorists who are incarcerated in Marion. Drive down to southern Illinois and no one even knows it because they'll never see the light of day. Never. So in terms of safety in America, we know how to keep America safe. We also know when we're wasting money. And at this point in time, we are wasting money with this Guantanamo facility. Let's transfer those for detention and trial into the appropriate places, have them tried successfully. I think we've had perhaps 6 or 7 tried by military commissions, only 6 or 7 since 9/11, and 2 of those were reversed. Most of them go into our court system. Even when they read the Miranda rights, it doesn't stop the convictions. The convictions come through regularly because our people know how to convict those who would threaten the United States and make it dangerous. So, Mr. President, I'm asking consent that my entire statement be made part of the record. I thank Senator Levin and Senator McCain for bringing this issue before us. We can no longer ignore it. We can't afford to ignore it. As General Eaton says, we can't afford to keep this recruiting tool open for al-Qaeda, and we cannot afford to continue to tell American taxpayers that they need to pay $2.7 million a year for every prisoner in Guantanamo. Transfer them to a supermax prison for $70,000. America will be just as safe, and it'll have money in the bank to use to fight terrorism in more effective ways. I urge my colleagues to support the Levin-McCain amendment and oppose the aye-out amendment and yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of Amendment 2255. And let me just say what we can't afford. What we can't afford is to read terrorists their Miranda rights and tell them they have the right to remain silent. Why can't we afford that? Because if we lose the opportunity to gather valuable information and protect our nation, then we can't prevent future attacks against the country. And here's the problem that we face. Here is the current head of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri. If we capture him tomorrow, I ask my colleagues this: do you want to send him to a secure detention facility where he can be fully interrogated under the laws of war and held there on detention of law of war authority? Or do you want to send him to a prison in the United States where we can't know? The legal questions are many, where there's a real risk that he will not be able to be held in law of war detention and will be told you have the right to remain silent, and we will lose opportunities to gather intelligence to protect our country. Now, my colleague from Illinois talked about the worst criminals that we put in prison. Well, I was a former murder prosecutor, and I put some of the worst murderers in prison, and there's a difference here. We're not dealing with criminals. We're dealing with terrorists, and the priority has to be to gather information and protect our country. And if we catch Zawahiri tomorrow, bring him to a prison near you, give him a lawyer, tell him you have the right to remain silent. Those legal questions are not dealt with if we adopt the alternative amendment that allows the administration to transfer people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, to the United States. And what do we do with future captures like Zawahiri? How do we ensure that we can gather information? By the way, that is priceless. If we can stop a terrorist attack by interrogating someone, the price we can save for America, we can't put a number on that. And if you believe with a rising reentry rate of 29%, which is higher than last year, in terms of people we've had at Guantanamo, we've let go, but have gotten back in the fight against us, that we should weaken the standards that this administration has to meet to transfer people from Guantanamo to third-party countries, then that is essentially what is done in the defense authorization. My amendment will restore existing law to ensure that there are strong national security waivers the administration must meet before they transfer prisoners to countries where they're getting back in the fight against us, where they're getting out and getting back in, including against our troops. So this is a fundamental question. We cannot afford right now, with what is happening around the world, to close the one secure detention facility we have. That is clear. We can conduct law of war detention there. We still remain in a fight against terrorists. We can't treat them like common criminals, and that is what's at stake here. And if you believe that this man should come in a prison near you, that's not what I've heard from my constituents or the American people. And that's why my amendment will prohibit transfer of the mastermind of 9/11 to U.S. soil and keep him in Guantanamo, a top-rate detention facility that keeps terrorists, as opposed to common criminals, secure. And finally, I would say that as we look at the prohibition on Yemen, my amendment, and that is also co-sponsored by the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee and many other members in this chamber, would prevent transfers to the country of Yemen. Without my amendment, the administration could transfer to Yemen. What does that mean? Yemen is the head where al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is centered. We have actually had terrorists who have been released from Guantanamo and gotten back into al-Qaeda leadership and been found in Yemen. And there have been prison breaks in Yemen. And yet, if my amendment is not adopted to keep the transfer prohibition to Yemen in place, the administration can transfer from Guantanamo to countries like Yemen, and the security waivers are weakened. The world is not a safer place from last year to this year, unfortunately. The re-engagement rate of Guantanamo prisoners has increased from last year to this year. So why are we weakening the national security provisions? Let's keep existing law in place. Why do we want to send Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to the United States of America when we have a secure facility at Guantanamo? And why do we want to take any risk that if we are blessed enough to have our men and women in uniform who do a fantastic job, capture Zawahiri tomorrow, to risk at all that he may have to be told you have the right to remain silent because there are legal ambiguities when he is brought to this country as opposed to law of war detention and interrogation in Guantanamo. That is what is at stake, and we cannot afford to think that we're no longer fighting a war against terrorists. We cannot afford to treat people like him like common criminals. As much as I believe in our criminal justice system, it was not created to gather intelligence, which is what we need to do to make sure that America remains safe. So I ask my colleagues to support Amendment 2255 that is co-sponsored also by Senator Chambliss, the ranking Republican on the Intelligence Committee, Senator Inhofe, the ranking Republican on the Armed Services Committee, as well as Senator Fisher, Rubio, and Barrasso. Thank you.
Has expired.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Unanimous consent request.
Senator from Michigan.
I would ask unanimous consent that letters from Secretary Hagel, Secretary Kerry, Attorney General, and Director Clapper be put in the record at this point.
Is there objection? Without objection. Under the previous order? The question occurs on the Ayotte Amendment number 2255. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Beckidge, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado,
White House, no.
Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Ayotte, Cornyn, Grassley, Inhofe, Johans, Sessions, and Vitter. Mr. McConnell, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baucus, Booker, Durbin, Levin, Manchin, Rockefeller, Stabenow, Warren, and Whitehouse. Mr. Rubio, aye.
That's really more the signing agreement.
Mr. Lee, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Kane, no.
We may. I can't say it's not.
Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Franken, no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, no. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Beckidge, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mrs. Hagan? Aye. Mr. Cochran? Mr. Cochran? Aye. Mr. Roberts? Mr. Roberts? Aye. Mr. Chambliss? Aye. Mr. Alexander? Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico? No. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? No. Mr. Graham? Mr. Graham? Aye. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden? No. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski? No. Ms. Heitkamp? No. Mr. Corker? Mr. Corker? Aye. Mr. Donnelly? Aye. Mr. Shelby? Aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado? No. Mr. Toomey? Aye. Here it is. Ready. Oh, thank you. Mr. Coons? Mr. Coons? No. Mr. McCain? Mr. McCain? No. Mr. Coates? Aye. Mr. Warner? No. Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Burr? Aye. Mr. Coburn? Mr. Coburn? Aye. Mr. Leahy? Mr. Leahy? No. Mr. Cruz? Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Flake, no. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Ms. Collins? Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. King? Mr. King, no. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, no. Mrs. Boxer? Mrs. Boxer, no. Mr. Pryor, aye. Ms. Hirono? Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Nelson, no. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. The entire American Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Harkin? Mr. Harkin, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Carper? Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Casey? Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman? Aye. Mr. Schumer? No. Ms. Cantwell? No. Ms. Landrieu? No. Mr. Reed of Nevada? No. On this vote, the yeas are 43, the nays are 55. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to. Is not agreed to. Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes equally divided prior to a vote on the Levin-McCain Amendment 2175. Senate will be in order. Senate will be in order.
Oh, here you
Senator from Michigan.
Madam President.
Senator from Michigan.
This amendment, which is 11...
Senate will be in order. Please take your conversations outside.